Good morning. Great. It's been a wonderful conference so far, hasn't it? And a great morning of fellowship over a breakfast and time of worship together. So, as someone coming from a very different professional perspective than many of you, I found the presentations and the conversations and the discussions to be very challenging and thought-provoking, and in many ways a catalyst to want to do more and to do more with others. So I'm sure that's true for you as well, and that's the point of this gathering in many ways. So the title of my presentation is Better Together, Inclusive Education for Children and Youth with Developmental Disabilities. And in public schools and classrooms across the country, and perhaps maybe even in some private schools, inclusive education is increasingly becoming the reality for more and more students with disabilities. And this includes those young people with very significant disabilities, people who we describe as having very extensive support needs. And where relatively recently those children were either excluded entirely from schools or maybe only on the periphery of everyday school life, they're increasingly being woven in to the fabric of what happens in these schools. And the recurring lesson of inclusive education in schools seems to be, in part, that all children with and without disabilities benefit substantially from having the opportunities to learn alongside each other, to develop relationships, and sometimes to develop friendships as well. But yet when those conversations start to turn about inclusive education, start to turn to congregations, many families, although certainly not all, start to speak of the struggle to find a congregation that will welcome and include their child and then keep welcoming them back week after week. And many adults with developmental disabilities never get those invitations, or never get those invitations more than once often. And so I think this is a missed opportunity, and that's part of the theme of this conversation is how do we change those missed opportunities. And so during our time together this morning, what I'd like to do is share just some of what we're learning about inclusive education in schools, what it is and why it works, and to provide some context for you to consider what inclusive education might look like within the context of congregations. So that's the charge in I think I was told I only have 2 hours. So I'm going to try to make that mark. But I wanted to begin just with a bit of a short reflection, personal reflection. When I was in college, which was here in Wheaton, Illinois, I attended a medium-sized congregation just a few blocks that was down the street from where I happened to live. It was within walking distance of where I lived. And it looked like many of the dozens, or actually this was Wheaton, maybe hundreds of congregations in that particular town. It had the large, tall steeple, the very well-manicured lawns, the big sign out front that let people know what they were and what was going on inside. And I think a glimpse, at least from the inside, of that congregation suggested that it was quite different than at least most of the other congregations that I had gone to when I was younger. And it wasn't really in terms of the services or the activities that they offered. It was really different in the sense of who gathered each week together in that congregation. There were people with and without developmental disabilities, people with labels like autism, Down syndrome, Fragile X syndrome, a variety of other descriptors that we put to people who do or don't do certain things. But they were actively involved in and seemed to be pretty integrally woven into the life of that particular congregation. Some of the members sang in the choir, some were greeters, some were ushers, some went on mission trips, some participated in worship services, potluck suppers, all the things that happen in the life of that congregation. And at that time, I helped to lead an adult Sunday school class that included both young people with and without developmental disabilities. And we would gather each week for that hour before the formal worship services. We would gather to pray and catch up and worship together, sing together. And I think for most of the people in that class, particularly I can speak for myself, that was something that I greatly looked forward to each week. It was kind of, in a sense, a reunion each week for us. But I recall very quickly just how surprised I was when I began to get to know some of my friends with developmental disabilities and learn where they lived and just how far they traveled every Sunday morning to get to that particular congregation. Many of them lived 1 or 2 or 3 towns away and not anywhere near that congregation like I did. And I remember sort of mentally counting how many churches did they drive right by along their way to this particular church because there weren't any other congregations, or very few, that were willing to invite them and welcome them back each week. And I wondered sort of how many people with developmental disabilities ended up essentially giving up on trying to find that kind of congregation, and how many families felt just turned away one too many times and never arrived at another congregation again. I wondered how many congregations were also missing out on something important because the presence and participation and gifts of people with developmental disabilities weren't part of that congregation. I think those of you who saw the movie last night can think about would that congregation have lost if Leor wasn't present. Not if people with Down syndrome weren't present, but if Leor wasn't present. So in about the 15 years since I was in college, which just gives away my age, I think, I've had the opportunity to live in a lot of different communities throughout the United States. I have moved quite a bit. And although the churches in those cities, I think, look quite different now. It seems they're getting bigger and, better, but bigger in many ways. My conversations with people with developmental disabilities and their families leads me to believe that not much has changed over that last 15 years. The landscape still looks very much the same for many people with developmental disabilities, and churches like the one I encountered in college seem to be the exception rather than the rule too often. And I think many people with developmental disabilities are on the peripheries of their community life, and particularly congregational life. So there's much work to be done, and I think some of that work could begin in seminaries like this and in congregations like you represent as well throughout the country. So according to one national study, more than 90% of congregations have some form of religious education opportunities for their members, whether that's Sunday or Sabbath school classes or children's programs or youth groups or adult small groups, confirmation classes, etc. So virtually all congregations offer religious education. So what would it look like for congregations to include children and youth with developmental disabilities in all the faith formation activities of their church, particularly the formal religious education programs? And so to begin to kind of get you thinking about what the answer to that question might look like, I want to draw from my work and the work of my colleagues in the field of special education to talk a bit about what schools are, how schools are striving, and I think also struggling to create learning communities where all children are able to meaningfully participate and contribute something. I think this is a work in progress even for public schools. But I think, as you'll see, I think what's happening in schools in many ways should be a challenge to congregations. I had hoped and hope in some places it's the other way around, that what we're doing in congregations is pushing other aspects of our communities, but I think it's often the reverse. So as I shared with you on Monday, my professional work takes place within the context of public education systems. I started my career as a high school teacher, high school special education teacher in San Antonio, Texas, where I worked with young adolescents with disabilities who were kind of transitioning to adult life. Those were students with intellectual disabilities and autism and multiple disabilities. And then for the past 6 years, I've been a researcher and teacher trainer at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So it's kind of a different angle to come at all of this with. And our work has really been looking at how do we include students in the life of their school, but what happens when we do that? What's different because we do that? Not only in terms of how students' social relationships and friendships, but what they learn, what they gain academically, what they gain socially, what they gain in many ways. And trying to document that kind of impact has been a really important part of what I do. So as you consider what inclusive education might look like in your congregation, I thought it would be helpful to have just a little bit of a history of how inclusive education is developed in K-12, kindergarten through 12th grade educational systems here in the U.S. And this is not meant to imply that the principles and the strategies that I'm going to share automatically translate to congregations. I think this will probably be a point of discussion this afternoon, but certainly the structures and resources and staffing and purposes of churches are different than public schools. But at the same time, I think there is much we can learn and have learned about inclusive education and how it's implemented and how it might be done that would be valuable for congregations. So I'll walk through some a dozen or so different elements of what characterizes inclusive education in schools, and for each of those really challenge you to think about what does that look like in a congregation, or what does that look like in the religious education programs that we offer. And then if there's time, I'll offer just a few tools or approaches that I think you might use to prompt reflection in your own congregations or in your own denominations about where you are now in terms of inclusive opportunities for people with developmental disabilities and where you might go next. What are some starting points for congregations? Because I think that is really the challenge, is how do we take sort of what we're discovering here this week and figure out what is our one next step in our congregation or in our seminary or elsewhere. And so there are some approaches for launching those kinds of conversations. And then finally, I think we'll have some time this afternoon for discussion. So let's begin. That was a 10-minute introduction. This is not boding well for my finishing on time. So I know through our conversations this week, many of you are already very familiar with special education services. In fact, some of you have been sharing much with me about the history of how that's developed in your particular areas. So it might be familiar to many of you, but I know that to many of you it's also sort of a new area. And you're probably familiar with at least the concept of special education, which is very simply defined as education and related services designed to meet students' unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. Those are those outcomes that education is aimed at. Missing from that, of course, are lots of things, right? Relationships, a sense of belonging, community, chance to give back and contribute. It's not that those aren't important, but those aren't, unfortunately, in the definition of special education services. And all the history of special education goes back more than 100 years. You might be surprised that it's only been 35 years since the federal law mandated that every student with disabilities, regardless of severity, is entitled to a free and appropriate public education. And that, I think, there in some ways offers a first challenge to our congregations. So, I mentioned in the timeline, as I mentioned these timelines and trends in service delivery, I want you to think about your own congregation or your own denomination or what's where you worship or where the students that you work with in seminaries are coming from. And think about the ways in which the history of special education does or doesn't mirror what's happening in your congregation. Are you sort of ahead of that curve, or are you still sort of, where are you in sort of this timeline? So in 1975, which is just 35 years ago, public education was inaccessible, poorly delivered, or completely unavailable to children and youth with developmental disabilities. And it wasn't until the Education of All Handicapped Children Act was passed in which we've often called Public Law 94-142, that mandated that all states, with the assistance of the federal government, had to provide a proper education to all children, right, regardless of the extent of their disabilities, and to do so at zero cost to families. So it was by sweeping federal mandate that this happened, and it was really by legislative mandate in some ways. And prior to that time, prior to 1975, 1 million children with disabilities were excluded entirely from public schools. 4 million children who were in schools weren't receiving appropriate education. Most students were not getting related services that they need: occupational therapy, speech therapy, related therapy. Disabilities went undetected, and families often really had to get services at their own expense. So it took a law essentially to change that at the national level and begin sort of serve as a launching point for education for all students, meaning really all students. So one of the 6 principles of this law was, and it still remains, called zero reject. Many of you have probably heard this before. Zero reject is one of the 6 key principles of special education law, which means that schools are absolutely prohibited from excluding any student who's identified as having a disability from a free and appropriate public education. That means no matter how severe someone's disability is judged to be, they can't be excluded. So choosing not to welcome a child in schools is not an option. So that's in some ways the first challenge. I wonder how many of our congregations also sort of operate under a zero reject policy. Not only sort of explicitly, but functionally do we operate that way. And I wonder what it might communicate to families when schools have that policy and our congregations don't. So that was back in 1975, and there really were a number of factors that came together to start to push schools to serve children with disabilities differently. And parent advocacy was, and I think continues to be, one of the most particularly powerful forces in changing how services happen in schools. My suspicion in many congregations today, it's also parents and their family members that are the ones spurring change. And yet my conversations with parents, and this may be true of yours, is that they may want to shed that role of having to be the constant advocate. Many of them are having to fight to get services and supports in schools and their communities, and the prospect of having to also do that in their congregation, just not there of all places. So the burden really shouldn't be on parents to have to justify why their children should be included in a congregation. So that was one of the prominent factors, and I raise that because I still think that's a prominent factor, at least in congregational circles. The other factors included professional advocacy. There were national organizations that were pushing people to do new approaches to service delivery. There were self-advocates who were articulating why this was so essential with a personal voice. There was research that was providing affirmation of the benefits of inclusive education. Indeed, not just the benefits, but the advantages of inclusive education. And those all begin to shape practices, along with lawsuits, right, which Peggy, I think, referenced earlier. So I mention these, again, because these were salient factors driving change in schools in the public arena. But I don't think many of these factors are prominent when it comes to the work of congregations. I don't know of any or many professional organizations, perhaps maybe there are some that are embedded within denominations, that are calling upon congregations to be more inclusive of people with disabilities, not at sort of a professional organization level. And parent and self-advocacy is prominent, but usually within individual congregations. There's no sort of coordinated efforts of parents pushing on congregations collectively. There's no overarching legislation, apart from within some individual traditions, if you would call it legislation, certainly. But there's no law that's mandating religious education for children with all disabilities. And to date, there's been very little research showing what happens when congregations take what we're talking about this week and start to do things differently because of it. So what are going to be the factors that are driving change in congregations? I think that's a great thing to ponder as well this afternoon. Who's issuing that compelling call to congregations? And how can you as theological educators and pastoral leaders begin to articulate why this is important and why we need to respond perhaps differently? So as I said, the law mandated that schools provide educational services to students, but that didn't mean that students with severe disabilities were actually participating in the same classrooms or the same lunchrooms or the same extracurricular activities as their peers without disabilities. They might be present in a school and really not any closer to those kinds of relationships that we've been talking about this week. In fact, the truth is that most students with severe disabilities were either separate in separate schools or wholly segregated from everyone in life of the school. So simply bringing people into the same place isn't enough. We all know that. So those early efforts of school services really focused on starting to try to capture the social benefits of inclusion, right? Trying to find ways of giving students with and without opportunities to get to know each other, to develop relationships, perhaps friendships. And so students with disabilities started to be mainstreamed into certain classes. That might be a gym or art or a variety of classes, but their home was in a separate or special classroom. So that happened largely in the 70s and 80s. That was the focus of our inclusion efforts, was just increasing some contact. Throughout the 90s, the perspective changed quite a bit. The perspective started to be students with disabilities should be in the same classrooms, the same general education classrooms as everyone else. And so the focus was on how can we create adaptations or modifications to address that gap between what a student with disabilities can do and what is expected in that classroom. So the focus was still not on changing anything about classrooms, but trying to sort of change something about students with disabilities or add supplemental support so that they could participate. Well, now we're sort of in a new phase of special education, which is let's not sort of just keep things the way they are and give students adaptations to participate, but let's rethink what is offered in a classroom for all students so that we design it initially with all kids in mind. So rather than designing a class that really fits the learning styles of a smaller subset of students and then trying to adapt for everyone else, can we think more broadly about how education is delivered? And I think that's this idea of universal design that I'll come back to. So really in just a few decades, the manner in which we educate students with severe disabilities, really the full range of disabilities, has progressed from segregated settings to providing education in inclusive general education settings with some adaptations to now providing them access to the same curriculum as their peers without disabilities. So in the mid-1980s, less than a quarter of students with disabilities spent almost all of their day in the same classes as their peers. So 1 out of 4 kids with disabilities spend almost all their time with their peers without disabilities. Today, that's changed quite a bit. Actually, more than half of students during their 8 hours of their school day, 5 days a week, spend almost all of their time in the same classes as their peers without disabilities. And again, you might think about sort of how does this mirror onto how we provide education to students in our particular congregation. So half spend almost all their time. About a quarter spend some time in general education classrooms, the same classes as their peers, and then sometime they may come out to resource classrooms to have a little more focus on particular skills. We saw that in the story of Leor last night, where he was in many classes with his peers and then had some targeted instruction. And about a fifth of students spend most of their time in the same school as their other classmates, but are largely in separate classes and might encounter their peers sometimes periodically throughout the day. And then a very small percentage of students, just 5%, who are in an entirely different school altogether. So they're in a different school or some sort of hospital facility. So the point here is that currently in schools, when you look at what's happening for students throughout the week, most of them are spending most of their time in the company of all of their peers that they live with in their communities. So sort of mirror that onto what's happening in congregations. And just because we're in Pennsylvania, these are what that same spread looks like here in Pennsylvania. If your zip code happens to be Pennsylvania and you're a student with the same types of disabilities, you're less likely to have access to come into contact with your peers without disabilities in Pennsylvania. So I'll come back to that point. So that brings us today and the end of my short history lesson. Current educational services are guided by what's called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And I'm sure many of you curl up at night with these sorts of pieces of federal legislation like I do, so I'm telling you something you already know. But to save you from that, on one of the first couple pages, this is what it says. And now contrast this with where I started, where we were in 30 years ago. It says now, this is the overarching law that guides all of services in schools. Almost 30 years of research and experience have demonstrated that the education of children with disabilities can be made more effective by having high expectations for those children and ensuring their access to the general education curriculum, and that means the same curriculum that all students receive, in the regular classroom to the maximum extent that you would like to do that or that you think it's can be. I'm sorry, I read that wrong. To the maximum extent possible. Right? It's very, very sort of direct in that call. And so how things have changed. In fact, the law says each state has to establish procedures to assure that to the maximum extent possible, children with disabilities are educated with children who are not disabled, and special classes, special schooling, separate schooling, and the removal of children with disabilities only occurs when the nature or the severity of their disability is such that it's education and regular education with the use of aids and supports cannot be satisfactorily achieved. So in other words, the presumption in schools is now that the setting of choice for students with disabilities is the same learning context as everyone else, that they're only removed when absolutely necessary. So where we started of students having to earn their way into general education, into classes, it's now the presumption is that's where they start unless we simply can't do it. And that part of unless otherwise is a source of great controversy, certainly. Now, I'll just add that sort of where we're going next is even pushing us further. About 2 weeks ago, there was a federal grant competition that came out that basically is funding college campuses across the country to provide inclusive college experiences specifically for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So that's quite a long sort of way we've traveled in a very short amount of time. So is inclusive education possible in the schools? Absolutely. It's happening in many, many schools across the country. The particular school district that is in close proximity to where I work is a fully inclusive school district, which means all students are served in the same classes with their peers without disabilities. And I think the capacity and the commitment to make inclusive education happen and happen well is increasing. And as I said, I'm not sure, though, that congregations and faith communities are always the ones leading, really, these efforts. Mike Giangreco, who's at the University of Vermont, he's a researcher, commented in a recent chapter that he wrote, something I think that's thought-provoking for this group. He said, yet for every student who remains educationally segregated, there are other students with similar attributes, abilities, and needs who are successfully included. And this simple fact suggests that whether a student with a disability is meaningfully included may have less to do with his or her characteristics and more to do with the attitudes, skills, structures, and practices of those adults who are responsible for providing education. And in fact, there was a study that recently came out of the University of Florida which looked at where kids spend their day in schools. And one of their findings was essentially that one of the most salient predictors of whether a student will be included or not is their zip code, where they happen to live. Not as much their characteristics, but where they happen to live. And so the resources and the commitments and creativity and talents of people within an individual school may be what matters most in some cases. So that brings us to this idea of some potential important elements in inclusive education. So lots of people have written about about religious education and sort of its link with faith development. All of your own faith journeys probably intersect somehow with religious education programs or experiences. And I think that it's just important, at sort of a general rule, to begin with the assumption that the experiences and relationships that were important for you in your faith journeys are probably also important for people with developmental disabilities, that there's probably not a separate set of things we do for people with developmental disabilities, or we don't start at that point. So we shouldn't assume there's a single recipe for faith formation for anyone, but we shouldn't automatically presume that people with particular disabilities need a separate set of things. So that's one of these presumptions. So what could we learn from these 30 years of providing education to students with disabilities in public schools that might be relevant for congregations and their religious education programs for people with developmental disabilities? What I've tried to do is just highlight, pull together about a dozen or so, I might add one or take away one, of some of the elements that characterize inclusive education in schools. And for each of these, ask you to think about what would this look like within our congregation or a particular congregation. So I'm sure you'll find some of my discussion of these individual elements either disappointingly brief or excruciatingly long, depending on your perspective. So here are the elements that I'll highlight. Presence, shared space, natural proportions, universal design, individualized planning, partial participation, natural supports, connections and relationships with peers, valued roles, prepared, committed, and caring educators, parents as partners, and leaders communicating a compelling vision. These seem to be some of the things that are important in schools or that characterize those schools that are doing inclusive education well. So let's start with this idea of presence. And I think we all are probably on the same page that presence isn't enough. Proximity isn't enough. But somehow inclusion seems to necessitate presence, right? I mean, although this probably seems self-evident and maybe unnecessary to emphasize, a glimpse into the everyday life of many churches suggests that it's the absence of people with developmental disabilities is probably the first thing that we might need to address. So we can have the most moving worship services or engaging children's programs or elaborate musical programs, innovative ministries, but if people with developmental disabilities aren't there, they're not there. So I think it's important in this case to underscore something that I raised on Monday, that the absence of people with disabilities from a congregation or its religious education programs isn't an indicator of their absence from your community. And so if you were to, or for the communities that surround your church, so if you were to go to any school and look at who's served in your local school system, what you'd find is that 15 to 18% of all children in your local schools have disabilities. This is true of every community. So who's missing then from our congregations? Or who's not part of our congregations that's part of our communities? Who are the kids that we might not be serving? And there's other demographics in our community I'm sure that's true of too. And so this is not a plea for a congregation to meet some sort of particular numerical marker or meet some demographic configuration of your congregation. It's simply to emphasize that there's a segment of kids in our community, and so who are really striving to reach out to and welcome into our programs. And to give you just a better sense of who that 15 to 18% is, at least in terms of the disabilities they have, here are some of the demographics of schools, at least in current years. Of that 15 to 18%, about half are students with learning disabilities. Some of these are children who wouldn't be recognized as having disabilities right outside the classroom, and they probably are in your congregations in many ways. So about half are students with learning disabilities. About a fifth are students with speech and language impairments. And then this is the group of students that I spend most of my time with. 10% have intellectual disabilities. We used to call cognitive disabilities in Wisconsin or mental retardation. Students with emotional behavioral disorders, 8%. It's a pretty large segment of any school program. And those are often, I heard that theme raised in lots of conversations, those kids with mental health challenges and their families are a real challenge often to serve well. Students with other health impairments and then other disabilities. And so those are percentages. Now think about your own state here of Pennsylvania. I know many of you are from other states as well. But that's an extraordinary number of kids in this state who fit those descriptions. There's more than 138,000 students with learning disabilities. But there's 17,000 kids with autism in this state. And the latest stats tell us that it's 1 in 110 children have autism, 1 in 70 boys now. So if kids with autism aren't in your congregation, they will be soon. And those kids grow up to be adults as well. So I thought those numbers just might sort of reinforce this point that these are children who are all around us. So how do we reach out to them? Well, I think part of it is extending invitations. And we talked about this last evening after Praying with Leora movie. I think one part of increasing presence is extending new invitations. And I think we might often already assume that we do that as congregations. We extend invitations to lots of people all the time. But I think for many people with developmental disabilities and their families, those invitations are never actually received, or they're not perceived in the same way that we perceive them. Simply saying, putting an ad in the paper and saying, come to our congregation, doesn't necessarily communicate to a family that when I come, I'm going to be welcomed or not ushered out or encouraged not to return. And so I think this is one of the steps that we begin to take of extending invitations. And this is, there's lots of ways we do that. I'm not sure this is the best way to categorize invitations, but this is the way I've done it. So there's those passive invitations, right, which are really more of announcements, right? Come to our church, everyone welcome, right? That's essentially a passive invitation. And people might see that and say, okay, I think they mean everyone probably includes me in that somewhere. And then there's those active invitations where we actually go out and extend those invitations to particular people. And then there's personal invitations. So I'll illustrate some of these. But you can see here's a church sign. This I just found on the web. I don't know this particular congregation. And they have said everyone welcome, which is the language that we use. But they've inserted a little bit of a symbol, an access symbol there on the bottom, which might communicate to some people that when you say everyone's welcome, you might have thought about me, perhaps. Others, I'll see this sign increasingly of all are welcome. And some specificity on who they mean by all, at least some sign that gives some particular suggestion. Some time ago, I looked through our local Madison paper just at all of the different advertisements, the right words, announcements about congregations. I don't remember the total number that I found. It was more than 100 in that particular Saturday paper. And there were 5 that had something a little bit different that indicated perhaps that they had people with disabilities in mind when they were issuing their welcome. Some used the access symbol there. Another simply used a clip art of children and adults, one of whom was in a wheelchair. Others put handicap accessible, handicapped access, or barrier free. So I looked in the Gettysburg phone book and didn't see anything along those lines. But I wonder what that communicates perhaps to a family member who's looking for a congregation, who's moved to an area for the first time, and is looking for some indicator of potential welcome. Other churches devote parts of their website to sort of outlining all that they have in terms of supports and assistance to individuals. And these are just 3 congregation websites. These happen to be very large congregations as well, I'll emphasize. But you can see, and I put the links on your website, or on your handouts, sort of how they share to people, even before they come, some indicators of what they'll offer when someone arrives. So in this case, assistance with special needs in terms of parking, wheelchairs, sign language interpretation, hearing devices, large print and Braille Bibles, someone to contact ahead of time. So people who are checking this congregation out for the first time might see those indicators right off the bat. Here's another church that does something similar where they had a portion of their website that emphasized their special needs ministry. And we can probably have conversations about the special needs ministry idea there. But these are congregations that are letting people know in their invitations that we need you, and here's the support and opportunities we offer. Another congregation, College Church, emphasizing their particular disability ministry. So these are 12 symbols here that are often used to promote or publicize accessibility of places or programs or activities for people with various disabilities. And they're kind of universally recognized in that sense. And there's many others, but these are all things that you can download for free on the website that I put at the bottom and incorporate into, if these are access issues that you address or support, they're things that you can weave into your congregational resources and materials. And here's just an example of how a particular congregation has done that. This, I think, is a smaller congregation in Canada. I'm also not affiliated with this one either, but you can see on their very front page they've put, "We strive to be an accessible church," and they put some indicators of that. We're cent free. Has anyone thought of cent free? Assistive devices, wheelchair accessible, and an accessible website. So there's a number of ways to let people know. Now, these aren't personal invitations. These are just sort of those passive, here we are, here's what we offer, and here's the accessibility features that we offer, in a sense. Another way to do this, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Interfaith Disability Network, which is out of Atlanta. And I think one of the innovative things that they've done that congregations could collectively do, or a denomination could do, is to compile in one place the congregations that are in their local community and the different ways, the different accessibility, the ways they have strived to be welcoming of people with a variety of disabilities. So if you go to their website, you can click on what they call Worship Link, which is a list of congregations in the area. And you can see there's a whole variety of different denominations, congregations from different denominations reflected. And what they've done is they've also put a variety of different accessibility features. So is the congregation accessible? Do they offer assistive living? Do they have a deaf ministry? One of those does. Large print, Braille, interpreters. Do they have religious education programs? Do they offer respite? One congregation offers that. Do they offer support groups, a way of connecting families? Do they have an access committee, summer camps, social programs? So they're trying to pull together for families and others just a list of the congregations that offer these various things for people who are looking for a particular congregation. So there's another way, I think, of extending those invitations and to sort of pull together collectively what's happening in a particular community. I'll skip this. So those are some ways to extend invitations or to communicate that welcome and to increase presence. Another is just sort of pulling from a congregation that I used to attend, had a sign. This is an adaptation of that, but in the children's children's ministry portion of the building where parents came to drop off their kids each Sunday morning for Sunday school. They had a large sign, it looked a lot prettier than this, that said, "We welcome kids with special needs. We're committed to welcoming children with special needs into our programs and activities. We believe that every child is created and loved by God. We are excited to have the opportunity to meet and minister to your son and daughter in order to best meet their needs." And it has some description of that. So families see that when they often come for the first time with some of their children and someone stays home with their child with special needs, they know that that congregation's thinking about them from the outset. That congregation, like others, struggled sometimes to welcome the kids that came, but they were communicating that they were willing to give that a try. Other congregations might just have signs like this. So those are, in some ways, passive invitations. I think there's ways of extending active invitations. Otherwise, it's just an announcement unless it's actually received. And so it's maybe letting local service providers in your community know that your congregation is accessible and willing to welcome people with developmental disabilities. So letting independent living centers know, or group homes, or parent support groups, which are exploding in virtually every community across the country, or residential facilities or nursing homes, and letting them know in advance, if you have an individual who's looking for a congregation home, give us a call. We'd love to talk and figure out how we can make that work well. And I put in your handout, but I realize it's impossible to read, sort of a list of all of the different organizations and associations that serve people with disabilities in most communities and how you get in contact with them. And so, I was part of a congregation that would just send an invitation to the local group homes and say, "We'd love to have anyone who lives here come. If you're interested in coming, give us a call and we'll work out transportation and all those sorts of things." So that's an invitation sort of to these groups in a sense. But I think ultimately it's personal invitations, right, that end up leading people into a congregation. I was reading the U.S. Congregational Life Survey. Anyone else read that at night? Am I the only? Just me? Something's wrong with me. And it says, though, something you all know, 75% of people who attend a worship service for the first time are there because why? Someone invited them to come, right? So this is probably a terrible example, but I'm committed to it now. How many of you like Domino's pizza? Okay, 3, 4 of you. Right, so that's the case. I don't know if you're familiar with Domino's Pizza's current campaign. They're basically confessing that they have not made good pizza. In fact, it's been not this is not of offense to those 4 or 5 of you who just raised your hand. And so they've developed this reputation of not making good pizza. And so their whole new campaign is going down to those people, individually to those people who haven't liked their pizza, and extending a personal invitation to you, try us again, give us another shot. We're going to try to do it differently. And extending that sort of personal invitation. And I don't know if you've seen their billboard campaigns, but these are their campaigns. They're targeted to individual people. So our phone lines are open, Scott Schroyer. Scott Schroyer, love our cheese, right? So it's but I think in a way, that's what we should be doing. We should not just be announcing what we have, but reaching out and extending personal invitations to people we know. And we all know, and people in our congregations know people with developmental disabilities, but they're not extending those personal invitations. So that's that first element of presence. And as I shared before, presence means proximity, but it doesn't mean that people actually encounter each other even when they're in the same building. Most churches offer a whole wide range of worship and learning and service and fellowship activities that are aimed at promoting, faith formation of their members. But when congregations often start to decide to intentionally invite people with developmental disabilities into the life of their church, often the initial step is to establish something separate. A separate Sunday school program, maybe a specialized ministry. And there's probably lots of reasons for that. I think partly it's those decisions may reflect the perception that a Sunday school class or worship service might be inappropriate for, too abstract for someone with autism or intellectual disability, or maybe that adapting activities would simply be too burdensome. There may be other factors that play into that. But one of the key concepts that undergirds inclusive education in public schools is this principle of least restrictive environment. That language is probably familiar to lots of you. But in schools, that means that students have a right to learn in the settings most like those with their peers without disabilities, and in which he or she can be successful with appropriate support. So those two go together. But in other words, the placement option first that should be considered is the same classes that in the school that the student would have been in if he or she didn't have a disability. So in this idea, disability is recognized as a form of human diversity, and so students should be accepted as individuals and not denied access based on disability. So that's the presumption. And again, I think when congregations only offer separate programs or only offer separate activities for people with developmental disabilities, the lives of many people in that congregation don't end up intersecting. And so, in a sense, we offer some important things, and some people are participating in those. But really, collectively as a congregation, our lives aren't coming in contact with each other. And so that sort of is missing that element of shared space. And I think it's often tempting. I see why it's tempting to set up separate programs for people with significant disabilities or to cluster them at particular congregations. But I think that makes it easy to also delay some important conversations about important maybe changes that could happen within what we already offer to all kids. So that's just another probably discussion point to raise. So do congregations have a principle of least restrictive environment? Is there some parallel there? Is our presumption that we begin with students are going to be in the same programs as everyone else unless we cannot provide appropriate supports to make that a meaningful experience? Is that our presumption? The third element or indicator of inclusive education, and I think one that schools probably really struggle to achieve, at least when it comes to students with severe disabilities, is the principle of natural proportions. And this really holds that students should be educated in classes that reflect the natural occurring proportions of students with and without disabilities in the population, right? So if a percentage of students with disabilities in each class would be, the percentage of students without disabilities in each class would be substantially higher than those with disabilities. So if 10% of students in a congregation have a disability, you'd expect 1 or 2 students in a class of 10 to also have a disability. And then age appropriateness is the idea that when students are in classes, they're in that with their peers. They're not in a class with individuals who are much, much younger because it seems like they're developmentally at the same level, but they're in peers, same proportions. So that's a third element. And that really, I think that's more an indicator of whether students are in inclusive classrooms sense. Fourth principle is universal design. And I think the universal design is probably familiar to many of you. It originated as really an architectural concept and emphasized the design of barrier-free facilities that were universally acceptable to all people. And so I'll illustrate that with just an example from a magazine story I read earlier this year. It was Reader's Digest, so it wasn't a sort of scholarly journal. But the article described the successful efforts of one Wisconsin town to build an accessible community playground for its children. And they meant all children, with and without disabilities. And I think, the majority of community playgrounds are either totally inaccessible to someone, for example, who uses a wheelchair, or they're sort of retrofitted. So a part of the playground is accessible, but another part isn't. So kids can sometimes play together, but not always. But the idea here was that this particular playground, from the very outset, was going to be one that was universally designed. So from the very outset, it was planned with every child in mind who lived in that community, and how do we make it so that everyone could benefit from that, play together, and spend time together? So one of the leaders who was involved in that building process shared this quote and said, people used to ask, why do you want to build a playground just for children with disabilities? Right? And she said they didn't get it. It's only when you build a playground for children with disabilities that you build a playground for all children. That was her quote. I thought perhaps that's in some ways the perspectives maybe we're being asked as churches to adopt. Can we design our programs and our services with a larger group of kids in mind from the very outset, rather than trying to figure out how do we retrofit things or change things? And what's the one thing that seems to keep happening is that, we know this with accessibility, that when we design a building with people with disabilities in mind, it ends up being accessible to a lot more people. People who use strollers, people who have children, people who use walkers, a variety of things. It seems that as churches start to redesign Sunday school programs with kids with intellectual disabilities and autism in mind, they start to get more engaging children's programming for lots of kids. That seems to be this recurring theme. So, when we build a church, we anticipate that certain people will come, and maybe we just need to broaden who we anticipate will come from the very outset. And so partly that's an architectural features. And this I just found on a website. I think this is in Germany. I'm not sure, but I think this is the most inaccessible congregation in the world. It's built into the side of a mountain, right? So they often... I don't think that's... I don't know. But nevertheless, we can ponder that, and it's been said in some ways our buildings say something about our theology, or at least who we thought about. And I realize there's historical aspects of many of these buildings in a sense, but there are just probably a few quotes that I think are worth sort of sharing here. We may be legally exempt from some provisions of the ADA, but that doesn't mean we're morally exempt in a sense. And I love this quote from Mary Jane Owen. Many of you have seen this, but it says, if bars are more accessible than altars, if theaters are more welcoming than churches, if the producers of PBS are more sophisticated about communication access than our liturgists, if the managers of department stores know better how to appeal to those with disabilities than our church leadership, if publishers of popular magazines are more knowledgeable about alternate formats than those who produce religious materials, then we failed to meet Christ's challenges to us all. So everyone else seems to be getting the importance of accessibility, largely for market reasons. So have we caught on yet? And so often that last step becomes the hurdle into a congregation. This other quote, if shut-ins can go to Walmart but not your church, they're shut out, not shut in, right? And so some of these are pretty simple remedies, like in this particular case of this last step. It's a fairly ready remedy that means the difference between someone getting in or not getting in. So, most of us are not architects. Most of us are not familiar with all of the accessibility requirements. And so a few years ago, I put together just a tool that would help you reflect on your congregation and its accessibility features, both physical and architectural, and other ways. And so sometimes it's simply having a group of people walk around the congregation, people with and without disabilities, and looking at all of your space and posing the question, how accessible are our sanctuaries and worship spaces? And having others who either use wheelchairs or have visual impairments, part of those congregations to do some of that reflection on your congregation. And there's also a number of different tools. I put this in the back of your handout so you can look at that sort of as you please. But a number of organizations and denominations also put out accessibility checklists that you can use to prompt some discussion in your congregation about, really, do we have a building that has everyone in mind? And so here's just a sampling of those that I'd encourage you to look at and take back to your congregations as well, and use this in some ways as a reflection tool. And there's other aspects of accessibility for people with chemical sensitivities. This is a sign that we saw in one congregation, a scent-free worship place, which, having grown up in the particular tradition I grew up in, scents were really strong in this southern church that I was at. So that's one aspect, scent-free areas. Food-free zones for kids who have allergies. I've seen some congregations will put up a section that is food-free. Gluten-free bread and juice is an accessibility feature. And a shush-free zone, which I particularly appreciate, having 3 kids who make a substantial amount of noise. And I was sharing earlier at lunch today, Mark Stevenson, who works for the Christian Reformed Church, was sharing a reflection once about sort of our expectations for silence and quiet throughout our services, and how we set up cry rooms for those people who are a little bit noisy and can't quite sit still. And he made the point, perhaps we shouldn't have cry rooms, we should have quiet rooms that are booths where those who can only worship in complete silence can go, so the rest of us can be a little more fidgety and noisy, and something you can ponder as well. So the fifth element, one person at a time. Special education in public schools is pretty unique in its emphasis on meeting the individualized needs of students with disabilities. In other words, we don't do planing at the level of disability categories. We do planing around individual kids. So what does this particular student need? What kind of supports and opportunities do they need to participate in this particular youth group or this particular activity? So this is in contrast with saying, because a student has Down syndrome, this is the program that they should receive. It's what does that individual student need? And so building those programs or those supports around individual students. And there's a lot of ways to do that. In schools, we bring together teams of professionals to answer those questions. I'm not sure that's, I think that's a good thing in schools, but I don't think that's required in congregations. And so one congregation that I was part of, one of the things that we did is when a family with a child with autism or developmental disabilities came and let us know that they had a child that was going to be attending the children's ministry program, we would invite them out to coffee and we'd spend an hour with them and we would just ask some of these questions to get to know them and their family and figure out what would it look like to involve their child in the life of our congregation. And so these were this is not a script of those conversations, but some of the kinds of questions that you might pose that allow you to know what that particular child might need. So what has been your child's previous experiences in congregation? Tell us about your child. What does she enjoy doing and not enjoy doing? What is her gifts and talents? What does she love to show off? How does she communicate with others? None of those questions are what is your child's diagnosis and the history of all those. It's sort of all about, can we get to know your child and then start to think about what is a child who loves to do those particular things, who loves to talk about these things, who has these particular gifts and talents. Can we find a place for that person in our congregation? The answer is almost always right, yes. But when we begin with, well, I don't know if we can include a child with autism, but can we include a child who loves this and who's really good at these things? Of course. So those are just some questions that I've again, put in your handouts and the things that you can look at a little bit further. So the sixth element of inclusive education in schools is the idea of partial participation. And so part of the planning that happens for individual children involves thinking very creatively about how they might participate in various aspects of an activity. And so this idea of partial participation comes up. And within this framework, a student doesn't have to participate in every aspect of something in order to be included, but rather you're thinking about the ways that the things that they can do within a particular class or in a worship service. So rather than sort of having an all or nothing approach, a student can participate in the same ways as everyone else, we start to look at what are the parts they can participate in, and let's build supports around those things. So this is really built around the notion that students can still benefit in parts of class activities when those are adapted or appropriately designed, even if they can't participate in everything. A seventh element is one of natural supports. And I think one of the inadvertent messages that might be communicated by all of my discussion of special education services is that it takes a team of specialists to support a student with disabilities in the life of their school. And that's often where we start in our planning for students. Even for adults, we first think, who are the service providers that can provide these supports? And we're really calling upon schools to think differently about that and start with who are the supports and people already present in a place who might help the child participate, rather than trying to bring in a team of outsiders or experts or specialists. And so, we have a trend in schools, for example, of paraprofessionals or individually assigned aides. It's exploding. There's 1/3 paraprofessionals in schools throughout the country. And this is pushed as a way of including students with autism in classrooms. The problem is that when we look at the data on the outcomes of those students, they actually become more socially isolated when they always have an adult at their side, right? So actually the very outcomes we're hoping for by providing sort of this team of specialized people sets students often apart even more. So how do we draw upon the natural supports that are already there in a class? And for us in schools and perhaps in congregations, it's usually turning to the other kids in the classroom. Right? This is what most of my work addresses in schools, and this is just a picture of one of the high school peer partner programs, which brings together kids with and without developmental disabilities, just in social activities during school and after school. But one of the main benefits of inclusion has always been emphasized, the presumed social benefits. And increasingly, I think in schools, as I've tried to point out, peers without disabilities are used to learning alongside their peers with disabilities. And although some might express some apprehension or hesitation towards interacting or getting to know their classmates with severe disabilities, most of those students that we talk with articulate pretty incredible benefits or personal things they gain from having developed new relationships with peers they hadn't otherwise had an opportunity to get to know. They talk about, in our interviews with them, things like a deeper appreciation of diversity and individual differences, a greater understanding of the value of inclusion, maybe increased knowledge about specific disabilities, better attitudes towards people with disabilities in general. They develop, acquire advocacy skills, greater commitment to sort of social justice principles. These are the things they articulate. But these are the future coworkers, neighbors, friends, employers of people with disabilities. So the opportunities they have to get to know them, I think, has a ripple effect in terms of longer term changing how communities welcome and receive these students. But what's interesting is they talk about those things I just said, and that's what we write about in our papers. But what they get most excited about and talk most about actually is friendships. I mean, that's what they talk about taking away from these opportunities to get to know their classmates. I think we often put we attach a number of other descriptors about this, but usually they're saying, I met a new friend, someone that I enjoy spending time with, someone who we laugh together, we have some things in common. And so we do have some efforts that we do in schools to equip those peers in a way, that might not be the right word, to interact with and get to know and support their classmates with disabilities. But it never is a disability awareness activity. We don't tell them the statistics on autism or the etiology of autism or its definitions. We usually give them some orientation about who is Johnny, what does he like to do, what does he like to talk about, what are some ways you can talk to him given that he uses a communication device, how can you respond and give him opportunities to share his perspective. Those are the kinds of things that kids need. They usually later on want to know, yeah, I also noticed he kind of flaps his hands, why does he do that? They're not really looking for a definition of autism. They just want to know that, that means he's getting kind of nervous. And what I could do is just let him know what we're about to do next. So I kind of have a way to respond to that. So there's some of that equipping of peers as well. I think the ninth element is this valued roles. It's often said that inclusion is built on the idea that all students should be valued for their unique abilities and included as essential members of a school community. But when you think about the way people with developmental disabilities are often viewed within society at large, and particularly within congregations, it's usually we talk about things in terms of ministry to people with disabilities. They're usually the focus of our ministry efforts rather than the ones, if this is the right word, doing ministry or ministry with. And so there's really an emphasis in schools also about not always putting students in the peer-tutored role or the sort of recipient of support role, but trying to find ways of what is Leo really great at? What does he have to share with other students, and providing opportunities for him to share those gifts as well. So there's some mutuality there. And those relationships we might, as outsiders, not always perceive as perfectly balanced. But there are opportunities for students to have valued roles within their classrooms, within extracurricular activities, and within a congregation. You can think of all the ways that people serve, whether it's ushers or greeters or gift bearers or choir members or musicians or preachers, right? So why do we assume there's certain things people with developmental disabilities do or don't do? The 10th element is prepared, committing, and caring educators. And I think that the success of inclusive education in schools seems to hinge in part on the quality of those teachers. And what you might not be aware of is that shift is going to students being served in typical classrooms. That means that most of the teachers who are serving students with disabilities are not special educators, but they're just teachers. And they just need to learn sort of how do I do good teaching that reaches a larger group of kids. And so this is, I think, a real challenge in congregations, and it often comes up of how do we equip those children's ministry leaders to be okay with and welcome all of those kids and to serve them all well. And I'm not bypassing that because, largely because of my time. But that's something we can also, I think, talk about is what are some ways to sort of encourage and give confidence to those people who are doing our youth group ministry and doing our teaching. The 11th, parents as partners. it's advocated strongly in schools. In fact, it's mandated that parents be invited to all of the decision-making processes that relate to their child in schools. And I've already talked a little bit about, in congregation, a simple way of having coffee with a parent and asking them some key questions is an important way of doing that. And there's a variety of ways that you can involve parents in sharing about their child, who they know better often than anyone else. But I want to highlight the importance of doing this in partnership with parents, drawing upon a study that Melinda Alt, who is a doctoral student at University of Kentucky, just completed. I had a chance to be on her dissertation committee and just asked if I could share some findings from her survey of almost 400 families of parents of children with developmental and other disabilities. She asked them, have you ever changed your place of worship because your child was not included or welcomed? And a third of those parents across primarily two states and even beyond, a third of them said they had changed their church because of how their child was or wasn't welcome. Now, I don't know I don't know what the number would be of asking any parents of whether they've changed a church because of the quality of the children's programming. But it's true for many parents of children with disabilities. And that, as for those parents, happened relatively recently. In the last 1 to 5 years, that change has been made. She asked them, have you ever refrained from participating in religious activities because your child was not included? And she found that over half of them had said yes, and that largely those had been recent circumstances in the last year or the last 5 years. She asked those parents if you'd ever kept your child from participating in a religious activity because support was not provided. Almost half had said they had done that. And again, that was in relatively recent experiences. So these aren't long ago experiences in the 70s or 80s or 90s. These are recent, fresh events. And have you ever been asked or expected to stay with your child at a religious activity so your child could participate? More than half of those parents have said, if the child's going to be included, the burden is essentially shifted on me to be there. Now, in the congregation that I was involved with, we often had parents come the first 1 or 2 Sunday school classes just so we could learn what we do. But we recognized that time was also a period of respite for them, and tried to create space so that we would be with their child so they would at least have that time to worship and fellowship with others. And again, this is recent. And the last question, have you ever been asked by persons at your place of worship, what's the best way to include your child in religious education? And this is the point I'm raising. I think it's simply asking these questions. Not simply. This is an important part of it. Many of those parents said no. No one has just simply asked that question. And again, that's relatively recent. So I think that prompts us to think about sort of just some simple questions we could ask of parents and how do we draw them into helping us make our religious education programs more welcoming. And usually parents are very willing to just want efforts. They want someone making the effort, and they're okay if it's not perfect or we struggle to do it well, but to know that we're committed to trying. And the last element, I think, that is really laced throughout work in public schools is the role of leaders. And in schools, that's principals and administrators. In congregations, you know who that is. But the vision that they set for their congregation or lay out and the supports and resources they provide really seem to make the difference between those schools that have adopted inclusive policies and those who haven't. It seems to all come back to the vision and commitment of leaders. And I think that's probably true in many congregations as well. And so there's lots of ways that congregational leaders can communicate that message. One avenue that many congregations do is these inclusion awareness events, inclusion awareness Sundays, and there's lots of resources out there that you can download that sort of speak to that. That's one avenue, I think, for leaders to communicate that broadly, but it also happens in sort of what they're willing to commit in terms of children's ministry staff training and resources and those sorts of things. And of course, as you know, there's a number of great resources by speakers here and elsewhere that can be shared with congregational leaders that might help them catch the vision of why that's important. So I've shared with you a number of different elements that I think are essential or important in public schools, and really challenging you to think about what would those look like in the life of our particular congregation, and what if we were going to do these things, what does that mean in terms of training congregational leaders differently to see why these might be important to pursue and important to support. I do think it's a journey. I like that metaphor that every congregation sort of starting at a different place, and that's okay as long as we're beginning to sort of move forward with some next steps. And I'll close, probably I should have certainly saved more time to get to, but to get you to think about some possible launching points. So what would be a first step in your particular congregation if these ideas captivated you in some way? And there's a number of different avenues you might pursue. I put in your handouts 2 different reflection tools that might be something that you start back in your congregation with a group of people who are interested in this issue and want to take some steps in the congregation to reflect on where you currently are and pick one place that you sort of will move next, one next step. And one way to sort of frame those conversations without having some of those tools that I gave to you is simply to pose 4 questions to your congregation or as a group within your congregation. And this is something that we did a few years back with a number of congregations in the Madison area where the pastor or the leader of the congregation would kind of hold an inclusion awareness Sunday. So the theme of the worship services would relate to many of the issues that we talked about. And then after the service, would just invite people to stay over coffee to gather and talk about, okay, given what we've heard, what can we do next? And so here's 4 questions you just might pose as that group. What are we doing well right now? So what are we doing already that we're doing pretty good at? It gets us kind of out of the negative. What could we be doing better? So what are some things that might lead us to just to some improvement? What are the areas we can build upon? What are some things that we could be doing differently? And then after sort of mulling through those answers to those different questions, what is one thing or 2 things that we can begin to do right now that'll get us started moving toward that goal? So it's called 4 simple questions because they're easy to ask, not necessarily because there's easy answers for those. And I put a link on there that sort of walks you through that process. But I think it's important to gather people together as a diverse group as you can, people from your congregation, maybe people who are service providers, family members, people with disabilities, to sort of reflect collectively on where are we as a congregation and what's just one thing we might do to move us a little bit further along that journey. So I would encourage you also to take a look at some of the reflection tools that I put in there as well and think about how where might be your starting point. So some reminders. I think there are lots of congregations on this journey that's reflected in this particular room. So this isn't something that congregations have to do alone. There's ways to connect with their congregations, and I would encourage that. I also am excited, just sort of reflecting on what I've heard here over the last few days, that there are lots of people who have figured a lot of these things out. And so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's lots of resources that are provided by different denominations, different faith groups that you can draw upon. And I would also encourage you to work with local organizations in your community, service providers, who are committed also to helping the people whom they support live a rich, full life in their community, and that includes their congregational community. And they can help you reflect on your congregation and talk about some of the supports that you might provide to students. And just to start with one thing, pick one starting point, and as you sort of move along that journey to celebrate, I think as your welcome starts to expand, to take time to celebrate that. And on that note, I will not lead us into discussion. I will lead us into coffee.